Good morning, London. It's really great to be here. As many of you know, I was also at the first MisinfoCon, which was at MIT. It was in Boston, which kicked off some conversations with some people saying, I think you should move and you should bring First Draft to Harvard. So unbelievably, the last 3 weeks, I moved to Boston, and it all kind of started at MisinfoCon 1. And now this is MisinfoCon 2, which is in my hometown. So I'm very pleased to be here. Lovely person. This is not, it's a way of me moving slides forward. Yeah, but it's not on this slide deck. Oh, great, okay, okay, fine. So thank you very much for inviting me. I know many of you, and I completely agree with this idea that this is an inside out. The great thing about MisinfoCon MIT was the fact that we actually all worked really closely together and had conversations. So the fact that I'm standing here is simply, I think, a way of just probably swearing and making some rude jokes and getting the morning going. But for those of you who don't know, First Draft started 2 years ago as a coalition. Google News Lab was one of our founding partners. And we were kind of a very small niche organization looking at how can we train journalists in understanding how to verify videos from on YouTube from Syria? How can we geolocate pictures on Facebook? And nobody else really cared. And then Trump got elected, and then everybody cared. And so now we are in this space of basically thinking about mis and disinformation and working with journalists to get them to think more critically about this. So if you are working in this space and you want to improve your skills, or you work in training or news literacy, we've just launched a 5-unit verification course. It's an online course which you can do in its entirety, or you can go in and out. There are 45 videos, 9 interactives. It's a huge undertaking, so if you are interested, please let me know. It's just for our founding partners for the first 2 months and MisinfoCon people. So I can get access to that if you're interested. And the other thing I'd say is, I really hope this would be launched today, so I could share it with you, but it's a report that's coming out on Monday. It was commissioned by the Council of Europe, and it's my attempt to try and bring together everything that's going on in this space. It's 30,000 words, but it brings together academic research, popular research, great reporting. It's already 2 weeks out of date. The new Twitter blog post went up 2 weeks ago, and I was like, God damn it. So this space is moving so quickly, it will be out of date quite soon, but you're my perfect audience for this. And it's an attempt to try and say, how can we think much more carefully about this question? It's a year on, essentially, since people started caring about it. Globally, of course, we know this has been a problem for a lot longer. Trump's election was simply the moment that America woke up to it, which means the foundation woke up to it, so now there's more money, which is a good thing. But ultimately, when we think about this, one of the reasons I don't think we've moved that far in terms of finding solutions is because we're actually not helpfully discussing this with definitions that are smart, that instead we're just throwing around I'm not even going to say the word. I'll get to that in a second. So I'm here to talk about lessons learned around 4 elections that we've monitored over the last 12 months, to say these are some of the trends that we're seeing. So when we're trying to think about solutions, how can we learn our lessons from those elections? So we worked at this time last year with ProPublica monitoring the US election, called Electionland, where we had over 600 journalism students monitoring reports on social media, as well as reports coming in via SMS in terms of voter protection. We then moved to France, and we worked with 37 different organisations over 10 weeks, monitoring disinformation circulating around the election, and published that on a website. We then worked with Full Fact in the room, who are, if you don't know Full Fact, they're amazing. And we actually tried to test the hypothesis, how can fact checkers work with verification specialists? And we set up a pop-up newsroom in Full Fact's offices and realized that we have to work much more closely together. And then we just worked with Corrective in Germany around the German election. So we've been busy over the last year. Each project, we tried to test a different hypothesis. The idea at First Draft is, how can we do research in the field? A lot of research on this is done in labs with American undergraduates. It's experimental research. It's very important research, but actually, how can we do more work in the field to actually understand how this is working? So the 4 lessons that we've learned. One, I'm going to say this, we have not got our definitions straight, and we need to be much more thoughtful about how we talk about this and what we mean when we talk about it. Thank you. Secondly, it's all about visuals and memes. Just because it's easier to pass text doesn't mean that that's all that we should be doing. And a huge vehicle for disinformation and agents of disinformation know that it's about visuals and memes. Our brains are a lot less likely to be critical of visuals, and they are pushing this out in meme shells, essentially atoms, that they talk about as meme shells. They're using the language of information warfare. We dismiss memes as, well, that's not really something we should concern ourselves with, but we should. Thirdly, collaboration improves journalism, and I'm going to talk about our experiences in France. And finally, we need to think much more carefully about what we report on, how we report it, and when we report on disinformation. I am very concerned about the way that we're currently talking about this, that I think in 15 years' time, social scientists will say we suppressed the vote by 9.7% through our reporting. We talk about there's a problem with trust, and instead we are pushing out reporting that is incredibly irresponsible, not itself based on thoughtful explanations of what we mean when we talk about hacking or cybersecurity, and it has implications, and we're not talking about it as an industry. I love you. So, one, definitions. Definitions. Some of you might know this. This actually was my very ugly slide at MisinfoCon 1 that Mark Little tweeted. It got picked up by Brian Stelter. And on the Sunday at MisinfoCon, somebody said, Claire, your ugly slide has just appeared on CNN. So then I had to very quickly ask a designer to make me something more pretty, which is what we did here. And I only use this. I did this on, for MisinfoCon. It's like, I think there's some stuff here I want to work through. I don't think it's perfect by any stretch, but the fact that it gets talked about quite a lot is because we don't have thoughtful definitions about this. And if we don't recognise the whole spectrum of this, we've got problems, because how are we trying to find solutions if we're just talking about news? It's not helpful. So that's partly why I think we need to think about this. But in the report that comes out next week, we talk very specifically around information disorder. And we talk about the distinctions between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. The leaking of emails. Those emails are genuine pieces of information, but they are moved from the private to public space to cause harm. So if we don't actually recognise what we mean by those dimensions of falseness, we need to think about what we mean by harm. I'm an academic by training, so of course I love definitions, but I'm not just saying this to be annoying. I'm saying it because we're not coming up with solutions, because we're talking over each other when we talk about what's happening in this space. So, secondly, visuals and memes. I think many of you have probably heard this quote, but it's still, I think it's chilling. And, oh, you see, where's my lovely friend? It's not on here to press play. Oh, look, it's on here to press play.
We memed him into the presidency. We memed him into power. We shitposted our way into the future. It's true. This is true. Because we directed the culture.
So this is an amazing This American Life episode that was broadcast just after the inauguration. This was somebody at the Deplora Ball, which was one of the inauguration balls. In terms of memes, go and talk to Arne. Where's Arne? Arne has done amazing work in this space in terms of memes, but really understanding what memes mean, understanding memetic culture, memetic warfare, memetic themology. There's a whole body of literature on this, as there is a whole body of literature about trust that we don't really tap into. There's a whole body of academic literature about fact-checking that we don't always tap into. So how can we understand this in a much more sophisticated way? And so this was some great work done by Brian Broderick around the French election, talking about these meme shells, American teenagers who couldn't speak French, who would take these atoms and basically launch them through Twitter raids into the American Twitter sphere. And so understanding the role of memes and their power because they are referencing culture. Memes make sense because people make sense of them through their own culture. They shift them through their own sense-making. That's why we have to understand memes as dangerous, because the brain power it takes to make sense of a meme means that you're more likely to actually cognitively make sense of it yourself. And in the UK and French and German elections, we're actually working now with the University of Sheffield with the Visual Social Media Lab, analysing all of the visuals and memes that came through during the French and UK elections for us to create a new typology so we can understand memes and visuals in a more sophisticated way. They are ugly, one. They travel like crazy on social media. We live in an increasingly visual world. This is what people want. And we also know people are less likely to click through from Facebook. So actually, when we study this, it's about headlines and visuals. This stuff actually is also very detailed. So one of the reasons we worked with Full Fact was to say, actually, can you help us with Theresa May's voting records? We actually don't know that as verification specialists. So we need to be working collaboratively to understand how, A, to computationally monitor and find this stuff, but secondly, how do you then make sense of this? I think this is Theresa May's Halloween costume, and she needs some better I don't like to say that as a woman, but this stuff just really flew around social media. And so how platforms find this stuff, make sense of this stuff, how can we use better technology to actually scrape off the text of this so we can actually build databases in the same way as fact checkers are? We've got a lot more work to do in this space, and we have to do it. So third, collaboration improves journalism. So in the middle of next month, we're launching our research project around cross-check. So we interviewed all the journalists that took part in cross-check, And all the French journalists actually admitted that their journalism had improved by taking part in the project because they were held to account by their peers. So in Crosscheck, we had journalists from multiple newsrooms in one Slack channel basically talking to one another about, I found this is my verification work, do you agree? So it forced them to be made accountable through their work. Secondly, from an audience perspective, they saw Crosscheck as independent and they trusted it more because there were multiple logos on the stories from multiple newsrooms. So in a news industry that says we refuse to work with one another because it's all about competition, unfortunately, if we want to make changes in this space, we're going to have to think through collaboration in much smarter ways. And that's, research is starting to really back that up. So finally, strategic silence. There's amazing work being done by Data and Society and Dana Boyds and her team, Joan Donovan as well, looking at particularly conversations in the far right, spending time in these online communities and understanding their tactics. And the minute you spend any time in these communities, you realize how much they're using the mainstream media as a vehicle for their disinformation campaigns. They are smart enough to be comparing tactics, but also sharing social psychology research with each other about if we do this, it will be more effective. Now, as journalists, we are completely missing this and being used by people who are trying to spread disinformation. And instead, we're just like, yeah, but it's going to get loads of traffic if we actually write about this. So, for example, lots of headlines around 21 states being hacked with no actual explanation of what hacking looks like. Lots being written about bots. If you look deeply enough, you will find bot networks. Yes, there were bot networks in Germany. Did they have an impact? Negligible. Did it have an impact writing a lot about the bot networks? Probably more. By writing really detailed blog posts about how you found all these bot networks and all these techniques, that's great. Can we have a researcher closed community where we share that with one another? Can we think about the implications of how we're writing about these topics and also what it means to not understand that we are being manipulated by these people who clearly, the slide's gone. Never mind. Here it is. This one by Ryan Broderick, who the weekend of Macron leaks clearly showed how they were jumping up and down every time a debunk was written about the Macron leak, saying, that's great, that's what we want. Debunks are a form of engagement. We are giving oxygen to rumours that do not need oxygen. And I'm not talking about censorship. There is a tipping point here where we as an industry have to work out when is it responsible for us to actually stop conversations and when is it irresponsible to do so. So the US media did not talk about the KKK for three decades. There was a reason why they didn't do that. I'm not saying that we should not be talking about these things, but how we talk about them is really, really important. We have guidelines about how we write about suicide. How do we think about this? Now, this is a little nod to Scott Klein, who, when he saw a presentation, was like, oh, MMD, Claire, as in like Miss Mal and Dis. I was like, that sounds a little bit like weapons of mass destruction, but maybe we're talking about messages of mass destruction. Anyway, it's a work in progress. But we wrote this recently on First Draft about 10 questions we need to ask before we write about these types of topics. Who's our audience? Why are we writing about it? In what forms are we writing about it? And we're really at a level now where we need senior editors talking about their policies around how we talk about disinformation. And my fear is that there's just this excitement about the things that we can write about without realizing what the implications are. And more importantly, we're doing the jobs of the agents of disinformation. We are sowing distrust ourselves, we are sowing confusion, and we are causing people to be turned off from the democratic process by saying it's broken but not offering solutions. So this is I don't have the answers, but what I want is more conversations about it. And what I would say is over the next 10 years, this is going to be the critical question that journalists need to actually think through. How do they stop themselves by being played? And at the moment, I worry that we're not having those conversations and we're actually causing much more harm than we're doing good. So thank you very much. I'm very excited for today, and let's actually do some good shit.